Darren and Nikki had been married for 8 years, and to the outside world, they were the epitome of a perfect couple. They had met in college, where Darren's quiet, analytical nature had perfectly complemented Nikki's outgoing and creative personality. Their wedding had been a small, intimate affair, filled with laughter and promises of forever. For the first 5 years of their marriage, those promises seemed unshakable. They traveled the world together, hosted dinner parties for their friends, and built a life that was the envy of everyone around them. But as the years passed, the spark that had once defined their relationship began to fade. Darren's job as a software engineer demanded more of his time, and he often found himself working late into the night. Nikki, who had once been his biggest supporter, began to feel like an afterthought. She tried to talk to him about it, but Darren always brushed her concerns aside. "We're fine," he would say, his eyes never leaving his laptop screen. "We're just busy. It'll get better." Nikki's loneliness grew with each passing day. She threw herself into her work as a marketing executive, but even her career couldn't fill the void in her heart. She missed the way Darren used to look at her, the way he used to make her feel like she was the most important person in the world. Now, it felt like they were roommates rather than husband and wife. It was during this time that Nikki met Julian, a charismatic artist who had recently moved into their neighborhood. Julian was everything Darren wasn't: spontaneous, emotionally expressive, and deeply attentive. He had a way of making Nikki feel seen and heard, something she hadn't felt in years. Their first encounter was innocent enough. Nikki had stopped by Julian's art studio to admire his work, and they struck up a conversation. But as the weeks went by, their interactions became more frequent and more intimate. Nikki tried to convince herself that Julian was just a friend, someone who filled the void Darren had left. But deep down, she knew she was treading dangerous waters. The guilt gnawed at her, but the thrill of feeling desired again was intoxicating. She told herself she would never cross the line, but the line was becoming blurrier with each passing day. Julian's art studio became Nikki's escape. She would visit him under the guise of supporting local artists, but the truth was far more complicated. Julian's paintings were bold and emotional, much like the man himself. He had a way of drawing people in, and Nikki was no exception. One afternoon, as she watched him paint, he turned to her and said, "You have a sadness in your eyes. I'd love to capture it on canvas." The comment caught her off guard, but it also made her feel understood in a way Darren hadn't in years. Their conversations grew deeper, touching on topics Nikki hadn't discussed with anyone in years: her dreams, her fears, her dissatisfaction with her marriage. Julian listened intently, his piercing blue eyes never leaving hers. He shared his own struggles, his failed relationships, and his belief in living life authentically. Nikki found herself drawn to his vulnerability and his refusal to conform to societal expectations. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Nikki found herself at Julian's studio again. This time, the air between them was charged with an unspoken tension. Julian poured them both a glass of wine, and as the hours passed, the line between friendship and something more began to dissolve. When Julian reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, Nikki didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her heart racing with a mix of guilt and excitement. That night, Nikki returned home to find Darren asleep on the couch, his laptop still open. She stood there for a moment, torn between the life she had built and the one she was tempted to pursue. She told herself it was just a moment of weakness, but deep down, she knew it was the beginning of something she couldn't take back. Hello, guys. If you think Nikki will keep that guilty pre-sure with Julian, please subscribe. Nobody runs away from karma. Thanks for watching. So, the affair began slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just lingering glances and casual touches. Then came the late-night texts, the secret meetings, and the stolen kisses. Nikki told herself she could stop at any time, but the truth was, she didn't want to. Julian made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, and the more time she spent with him, the more distant Darren became. Darren, oblivious to the changes in his wife, continued to pour himself into his work. He noticed that Nikki seemed happier lately, but he assumed it was because of her new hobby, painting. She had even started taking art classes, or so she claimed. In reality, those classes were spent in Julian's studio, where the lines between art and intimacy blurred. One rainy afternoon, Nikki and Julian crossed the point of no return. They had been working on a painting together, their hands brushing against each other as they mixed colors. The tension between them was palpable, and when Julian finally kissed her, Nikki didn't resist. The guilt she had been fighting was drowned out by the intensity of the moment. For the first time in years, she felt desired, cherished, and alive. That evening, Nikki returned home to find Darren cooking dinner. He smiled at her, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. She forced a smile in return, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew she had crossed a line, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. The affair had become her escape, her rebellion against the monotony of her marriage. As the weeks went by, Nikki became more reckless. She began spending nights at Julian's apartment, telling Darren she was staying with a friend. But the lies were starting to take their toll. She was constantly on edge, afraid that Darren would discover the truth. One evening, Darren came home early from work and found Nikki's phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Julian. "I can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again?" Darren's heart sank as he read the message. He had always trusted Nikki implicitly, but now doubt crept in. He confronted her that night, his voice trembling with anger and hurt. Nikki tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was undeniable. She broke down in tears, confessing everything. Darren was devastated. He had always believed their marriage was unbreakable, but now it felt like a lie. He demanded to know why, and Nikki struggled to explain. She told him about the loneliness, the lack of passion, and the way Julian made her feel. Darren listened in silence, his heart breaking with every word. He had always thought they were happy, but now he realized how blind he had been. The revelation shattered their perfect facade, leaving behind a painful reality neither of them was prepared to face. As the affair continued, Nikki became adept at lying. She fabricated stories about work meetings, girls' nights, and art classes to explain her absences. Darren, ever trusting, never questioned her. He was too preoccupied with his own life to notice the changes in his wife. Meanwhile, Julian became more demanding, pushing Nikki to spend more time with him and less with Darren. The guilt began to weigh heavily on Nikki, but she couldn't bring herself to end the affair. Julian had become her addiction, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. She tried to convince herself that she was still in control, but the truth was, the affair was controlling her. One night, after a particularly intense argument with Julian, Nikki returned home to find Darren waiting for her. He had prepared a romantic dinner, complete with candles and her favorite wine. For a moment, Nikki felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took her breath away. But as Darren smiled at her, oblivious to her inner turmoil, she pushed the feeling aside. She told herself she deserved this, that she had sacrificed enough for her marriage. As they ate dinner, Darren talked about his plans for their future, a vacation to Italy, a new house, maybe even starting a family. Nikki nodded along, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about Julian and the life they could have together. The web of lies she had spun was tightening around her, but she couldn't see a way out. The affair continued for months, with Nikki growing more reckless. She began spending nights at Julian's apartment, telling Darren she was staying with a friend. But the lies were starting to take their toll. She was constantly on edge, afraid that Darren would discover the truth. One evening, Darren came home early from work and found Nikki's phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Julian. "I can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again?" Darren's heart sank as he read the message. He had always trusted Nikki implicitly, but now doubt crept in. He confronted her that night, his voice trembling with anger and hurt. Nikki tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was undeniable. She broke down in tears, confessing everything. Darren was devastated. He had always believed their marriage was unbreakable, but now it felt like a lie. He demanded to know why, and Nikki struggled to explain. She told him about the loneliness, the lack of passion, and the way Julian made her feel. Darren listened in silence, his heart breaking with every word. He had always thought they were happy, but now he realized how blind he had been. The revelation shattered their perfect facade, leaving behind a painful reality neither of them was prepared to face. In the days that followed, Darren moved into the guest room, unable to bear the thought of sharing a bed with Nikki. The house, once filled with laughter and love, was now a cold, silent space. Darren struggled to process what had happened, while Nikki grappled with the consequences of her actions. Julian, sensing Nikki's turmoil, became more possessive. He demanded that she leave Darren and start a new life with him. But Nikki was torn. She still loved Darren, despite everything, and the thought of leaving him was unbearable. At the same time, she couldn't imagine giving up Julian and the passion he brought into her life. Darren, meanwhile, sought solace in his work. He threw himself into his projects, using them as a distraction from the pain. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the image of Nikki and Julian together. The betrayal cut deeper than he had ever imagined, and he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive her. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between Darren and Nikki grew. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was filled with tension and resentment. The life they had built together was crumbling, and neither of them knew how to fix it. One evening, Darren came home to find Nikki packing a suitcase. She told him she needed space to figure things out, but Darren knew the truth. She was leaving him for Julian. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, but he didn't try to stop her. He was too tired, too hurt to fight anymore. As Nikki walked out the door, Darren felt a strange sense of relief. The constant tension and uncertainty were gone, replaced by a painful but clear reality. He knew he had to start over, but the thought was both terrifying and liberating. Nikki, on the other hand, was filled with doubt. She had chosen Julian, but now she wasn't sure if it was the right decision. The passion that had drawn her to him was still there, but so was the guilt and the fear of the unknown. She had left behind the stability of her marriage for a life that was anything but certain. As she drove to Julian's apartment, Nikki couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. She had chosen her path, and she would have to live with the consequences. Life with Julian was everything Nikki had imagined: exciting, unpredictable, and passionate. But it was also exhausting. Julian's moods were unpredictable, and his possessiveness was starting to feel suffocating. Nikki found herself missing the stability of her life with Darren, but she knew there was no going back. Julian's art studio, once a place of escape and creativity, now felt like a cage. He wanted to know where she was at all times, and if she didn't respond to his text immediately, he would accuse her of losing interest. Nikki tried to reassure him, but the more she gave, the more he demanded. She had left Darren for this, but now she wasn't sure if it was worth it. Darren, meanwhile, was slowly rebuilding his life. He started therapy, reconnected with old friends, and even took up a new hobby, photography. He still thought about Nikki every day, but the pain was becoming more manageable. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. Nikki and Darren's paths crossed occasionally, usually at social events or mutual friends' gatherings. The encounters were awkward and painful, but they both tried to be civil. They had shared too much to become strangers, but they were no longer the people they had been. As time went on, Nikki began to question her decision. Julian was everything she had wanted, but he wasn't enough. She missed the life she had built with Darren, but she knew it was gone forever. The affair had changed everything, and there was no going back. Nikki's relationship with Julian began to unravel. His possessiveness turned into jealousy, and his passion into anger. They fought constantly, and Nikki found herself walking on eggshells around him. She had left Darren for this, but now, she wasn't sure if it was worth it. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Nikki packed her bags and left Julian's apartment. She had nowhere to go, so she checked into a hotel and spent the night crying. She had lost everything: her marriage, her stability, and now Julian. She felt like she had hit rock bottom. Darren, meanwhile, was starting to find peace. He had forgiven Nikki, not for her sake, but for his own. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could control his future. He started dating again, cautiously at first, but with an open heart. When Nikki reached out to him, asking to meet, Darren agreed. He wasn't sure what she wanted, but he knew he needed closure. They met at a coffee shop, and for the first time in months, they talked openly and honestly. Nikki apologized for everything, and Darren accepted her apology. But he also made it clear that there was no going back. Nikki moved to a new city, hoping to start over. She found a job, made new friends, and even started dating again. But she never forgot Darren or the life they had shared. She had learned the hard way that passion wasn't enough to sustain a relationship, and that stability and trust were just as important. Darren, meanwhile, found love again. It wasn't the same as what he had with Nikki, but it was real and honest. He had learned from his mistakes and was determined to build a relationship based on communication and mutual respect. Years later, Nikki and Darren ran into each other at a mutual friend's wedding. They smiled at each other, a silent acknowledgement of the past they had shared and the lives they had built since. They had both moved on, but the memories of their time together would always remain. As they danced with their respective partners, Nikki and Darren realized that their story, though painful, had shaped them into the people they had become. They had both found happiness, but it had come at a cost. And in the end, that was a price they had to pay.